this is a step-by-step video tutorial on sewing a top with butterfly sleeves. In my Etsy pattern shop, I've included height grading. Before we start the sewing process, I suggest preparing the top pieces and applying interfacing to them in the specified areas. So, in front of me is the back piece. We need to apply a strip of interfacing along the center edge of the back piece. The width of the strip is 1 centimeter. Since the zipper will be attached in this area, we'll reinforce the fabric with the strip of interfacing. On the front pieces, we need to apply interfacing to the edges of the V neckline to prevent stretching in this area. It's also necessary to apply interfacing to the top edge of the yoke. Now the pieces are ready for assembly. Let's start with the back pieces. Finish the raw central edges with an overlock. There are darts on the back pieces. I match the dart lines and pin them together. I align the dart lines from the wrong side. So the darts. After sewing the darts, it's necessary to press them towards the center edge of the back piece. The excess fabric at the dart should be trimmed, leaving a seam allowance of 1 centimeter, and I'll do this with the overlock. It's crucial to pay attention to hiding the thread tails at the beginning of the dart inside the dart itself. Don't just cut off the threads. It won't look neat if the thread ends stick out, especially since this top is sewn without lining fabric. First, I twist the threads of the overlock and make a knot at the very beginning of the dart to prevent the overlock threads from unraveling. Then, I tuck the ends of the overlock threads into the overlock stitch from the wrong side of the overlock seam. This way, the threads are threaded into the seam from the underside of the dart, and from the front side of the dart, everything looks neat, with the ends of the overlock threads secured and hidden. To finish the neckline of the back piece, we need to fold the seam allowance twice by 0.5 centimeters to the wrong side. Before stitching the seam on the sewing machine, I recommend first securing it with hand stitches. Then, it's essential to press the neckline, and only then stitch it on the sewing machine. I stitched the seam from the wrong side of the back piece, 0.1 centimeters from the lower edge of the folded seam allowance. Moving on to sewing the front part of the top, we need to finish the raw edges with an overlock stitch. I fold the seam allowance to the wrong side and press it. Don't skip the pressing steps for seams and pieces, as it affects the overall appearance of your top. From the front side of the front pieces, I stitched the seam 0.5 centimeters from the edge. After stitching the seam, I press the seams again. Let's work on the yoke now. We need to transfer the gathering marks from the pattern onto the fabric. I make small snips to transfer the marks from the pattern to the fabric. Additionally, I mark these lines with chalk. In the center of the yoke, we need to mark a square where all sides are 1 centimeter long. This means measuring 1 centimeter from the upper central point in both directions and then connecting these points to form a square where all sides are 1 centimeter long. Alright, all the marks on the yoke are transferred and marked. Now we can attach the first front piece to the yoke. I take the upper front piece, turn it inside out, so the right sides of the pieces are inside. I align the upper front piece with the marked line in the center of the yoke and pin it in place. I continue aligning the pieces. And the last pin at this stage should be placed exactly where our first mark is. Now, I take the side edge of the upper front piece and align it with the side edge of the yoke. I continue aligning the pieces precisely until reaching the location of the second mark on the yoke. At this place on the upper front piece, we make gathers using hand stitches. Please note that these should be small hand stitches. This will ensure that the gathers at this point look beautiful. If you make large hand stitches, the gathers in this area may not look as nice. After gathering the fabric on the upper front piece sufficiently, I make a couple of stitches at the end to secure the gathers. Then, I distribute the gather evenly and pin them in place. Now we can sew. Remember to backstitch at the beginning and end of the seam. After sewing, I remove the threads from the hand stitches. To make it convenient to attach the second upper front piece to the yoke, make sure the first piece that has already been sewn is directed upwards. Take the second front piece and align it with the center line that we marked initially. Pin it in place. The last pin at this stage should be placed exactly where the first mark on the yoke is located. Take the side edge of the upper front piece and align it with the side edge of the yoke. Continue connecting the pieces precisely until reaching the location of the second mark on the yoke. In other words, the last pin on this side should be placed where the second mark on the yoke is. Make gathers on the upper front piece using small hand stitches. pin them in place. Then, stitch. Make sure that the already attached first front piece remains directed upwards. This way, you can accurately and neatly finish the seam along the center of the yoke. Remove the threads from the hand stitches once you're done. The raw edges need to be finished with an overlock. From the front side, the seam allowance peeks out in the center. I flipped the pieces to the wrong side. To ensure that this seam allowance doesn't peek out, one side of the seam allowance is directed downwards, while the other side is directed upwards. This is done to fold the seam allowance inward at the center. Now, on the other side, direct the seam allowance downwards as well. This way, the seam allowance is folded inward at the center and won't peek out from the front side. Secure the folded seam allowance in the center with hand stitches. Make sure these hand stitches aren't visible from the front side. This means only catching the seam allowance with the stitches, without touching the main fabric. With the seam allowances directed downwards, I secure them additionally with hand stitches from the front side and press them. Now, we join the back and front pieces. Align the pieces along the shoulder and side edges. The right sides of the pieces are facing inward. Sew them together. Let's move on to finishing the sleeves. We need to make notches along the center line at the top and bottom so that you can properly align the sleeve with the armhole. On the wrong side of the sleeve, I fold the seam allowance by 0.5 centimeters and stitch it 0.1 centimeters from the edge. Since the sleeve has a circular shape, for finishing the outer edge of the sleeve, I've chosen the Moskov seam. After stitching the seam, trim the seam allowance, leaving 0.2 centimeters from the stitch. It's essential to first press the first seam to remove any waves that may have formed. On the wrong side of the sleeve, fold the seam allowance by 0.3 centimeters and stitch. Stitch the seam from the right side of the sleeve, folding the seam allowance by 0.3 centimeters to the wrong side. Using this method, there will be only one row of stitching visible from the right side of the sleeve, while there will be 2 rows visible from the wrong side. Press the sleeve again to remove any waves that may have formed. Now, we can attach the sleeves to the armholes. Make sure to finish the raw side and shoulder edges with an overlock. Press the seam allowances on the shoulder and side seams towards the back. I've also finished the lower raw edge with an overlock. Now, using the center marks on the sleeve, align the mark at the lower part of the sleeve with the side seam and the mark at the upper part of the sleeve with the shoulder seam. Please note that the right sides of the pieces are folded inward. Continue attaching the sleeve to the armhole, moving from the bottom to the top. This way, if the sleeve turns out to be larger than the armhole, you'll be able to gather the top of the sleeve. I mention this so that you don't worry if your sleeve turns out larger than the armhole. It's possible in different sizes. Therefore, it's important to attach the sleeve to the armhole from the bottom to the top. so the sleeve to the armhole. Also, finish the raw edges of the armhole with an overlock. I'll be using a regular zipper, but this process also applies to an invisible zipper. I'll be sewing the zipper so that it opens from bottom to top. Since this top is fitted, if you sew the zipper to open from top to bottom, you simply won't be able to put on it because the waist circumference is much smaller than the bust circumference. I turned the top to the wrong side and aligned the center edges of the back piece. I measured the length of the zipper, ensuring that there is also a 1 cm seam allowance along the bottom edge of the zipper for hemming. From the neckline down to the mark, I sew a regular seam. Then, I make a back stitch. On the sewing machine, I set the maximum stitch width, which for me is 4 mm, and sew a temporary stitch from the mark down. I press open the seam allowances. I place the zipper with the wrong side up and secure it with pins to the seam allowance on one side and the other. I turn the top right side out and remove the temporary stitch up to the mark at the top of the zipper. I unzip the zipper and sew each side of the zipper. If you're sewing an invisible zipper, make sure the stitch is close to the zipper teeth. Now, it's time to finish the bottom edge. I fold the seam allowance by 1 cm to the wrong side and pin it in place. Then, I secure it with hand stitches. Before sewing the bottom edge, it's important to press it. From the right side, I sew a finishing stitch 0.5 centimeters from the edge. The process of sewing the top with butterfly sleeves is complete. You can find a link to the pattern in the description below this video. Bye.